Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law on Film. Today, we're here with a special commentary bringing back Peggy McGuinness, professor at St. John's Law School, to talk again about a movie we covered in episode 40, Syriana. We released the episode in March 18th, 2025, so a little over a year ago. So at that time, President Trump was wreaking havoc throughout the U.S., but he hadn't really turned his full sights on the global stage. Well, now in 2026, that's no longer true. The year began with the threatened invasion of Greenland, the military operation to remove the leader of Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro, in Operation Absolute Resolve. These names are just amazing, amazingly terrifying. And then, of course, the war, the U.S. joint war with Israel against Iran, which began on February 28th. That's the Operation Epic Fury, which killed the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, other top military and security officials, but rapidly turned into a quagmire. So Peggy's back because we just figured we've got to talk about this movie again and why this movie, Syriana, the political thriller written and directed by Stephen Goggin, starring George Clooney as CIA officer Bob Barnes, is so incredibly relevant. Peggy, why is this movie so,
Oh my gosh. So the question becomes, I think, we talked about a year ago whether it was prescient. Now we have to sort of think about it. Is it a documentary and a predicting model for the next, 20 years of U.S. foreign policy? Yeah. So bringing it up to date, there's so much in this film that plays out, right? The long-term struggle that the United States has had since the Iranian Revolution and its relationship to Iran, the continuation of the sanctions, and the role that Iran plays in the global energy market. So all that sort of is playing out in real time. And I think what's interesting about the Trump administration is the central story that we talked about last time was sort of, these shadowy figures and the power players in Washington, and particularly the Christopher Plummer character, Dean Whiting, as kind of an archetype of these behind the scenes, very powerful lawyers who've been in and out of various administrations. He'd also clearly had an intel background because in one scene he talks about having been in Beirut, and he's there as sort of the behind the scenes puppet master for this Gulf Emirate or this Gulf state called Syriana, but which could be one of the Emirates, right? It could be, and in fact, it was filmed, I believe, in the Emirates, and so it could be Dubai in the current scenario. I do think that that's changed, though. That this war, while there are still those people in the background that sound like a committee to liberate Iran that's in the movie, who've pushed for conflict with Iran for some time or just confront it more fully, because we've been in obviously proxy conflicts for a while. This war seems to be fully Trumpian. And we can talk about what's different about Trump's approach to decision-making outside of these normal institutions and the intel community, and how that maybe is where today's reality branches off from the very prescient and fully grounded reality of the 2005 film.
There's one scene early in the movie where George Clooney character is sort of briefing folks in D.C. about Iran.
And our analysis seems to be on the mark. We're getting good satellite coverage. We're reprogramming resources into
Thank
Iran.
You for coming over, Mr. Barnes. Welcome back, and forgive me if I wade right in, but forgetting for a second your bureaucratic checklist. I'm trying to get undigested information.
Well, the best of our ability.
India is now our ally. Russia is now our ally. Even China will be an ally. Everybody between Morocco and Pakistan is the problem. Failed states and failed economies, but Iran is a natural cultural ally of the U.S. Persians do not want to roll back the clock to the 8th century. I see students marching in the streets. I hear Khatami making the right sounds. And what I'd like to know is, if we keep embargoing them on energy, then someday soon, are we going to have a nice, secular, pro-Western, pro-business government?
It's possible. It's complicated.
Of course it is, Mr. Barnes. Thank you for your time.
They let young people march in the street, and the next day they shut down 50 newspapers. But if you satellite dishes up on the roofs, let them have my two dads, that doesn't mean that the Ayatollahs are surrendering one iota of control over that nation.
Mr. Barnes, the reform movement in Iran is one of the president's great hopes for the region and crucial to the petroleum security of the United States.
These gentlemen are with the CLI.
The Committee for the Liberation of Iran, Mr. Barnes.
The scene, it's sort of like, it seems, eerily familiar and distinct.
It's familiar from a time when you can imagine a sort of senior expert in a region, and he's fully framed as an expert in Iran, in Hezbollah, in the Iranian terrorist networks in the Middle East. In the opening scene, he's speaking Farsi, that he comes in to brief these policymakers, right? And it's the Viola Davis character and others in the room who are advising the president. I think this is where reality branches out, because from all the public reporting, none of this really happened in Trump's decision making, right? So the process that we normally think of as the interagency intelligence process, the National Security Council, all that's been broken down and doesn't happen in sort of normal procedure. By the way, I think it parallels, and we can talk about the DOJ normal procedure too, right? There's no normal procedure in DOJ as we once knew it pre-Trump 2.0, and there's no normal procedure in the foreign policy making process anymore. So while I think the interests are accurate in that scene, particularly, this idea that energy security, sort of global energy security for sure, still relies on the Strait of Hormuz and access to the delivery systems out of the Gulf states and Iran, it's not clear that that's, we've had dozens of rationales floated after the decision to use force. It's not clear what the central rationale for this conflict is. And of course, it's been done illegally without any consultation or decision making in Congress, which in 2005 was an era when there was constant briefing of Congress on the war in Iraq that had been approved after almost a year-long deliberation publicly and on Capitol Hill with the Bush administration. So we are in a completely different decision-making era, even though the underlying players in terms of the states in the region and the interests are the same.
There's also some sort of evolving idea of in this region in the Middle East, right? There's a lot, the sort of fictional land of Syria, which is sort of like a stand-in for the Emirates, right? And what's that like? And now after, as we're in the midst of the war in Iran, it looks kind of similar and different as well.
Well, there's some long shots, I think, of I think there are long shots of Dubai from 20 plus years ago now. And of course, that's completely been built up, and it became a center for the kinds of work that the Matt Damon character, Brian Woodson, was doing, right? Consulting, finance, law, all of those international, transnational firms that have moved to the Emirates in the last 20 years. The vision of a Gulf monarchy that is liberalized and has expanded its, sort of diversified its economy away from oil and gas has come to fruition. The problem is they're not secure, right? So once you have a threat to the liquid, natural gas lines that they showed being opened up, or the delivery of crude, the fantasy has kind of fallen apart. And we saw that with Iran's attacks on civilian targets like the hotel and the airport and so on, and the ways in which the economy in some ways had to grind to a halt with the airports and the airspace shut down. But some of it has come true. And I think there's all sorts of questions that remain, like what is the future of the Emirates, right? What does their future security look like? Is the U.S. still going to be the guarantor?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when in 2005, when the movie came out, the Emirates, right, Qatar were not what they are today in terms of the kind of global crossroads, even for the aviation industry, what they are now, which is so much sort of like, global travel.
Yeah, the Dubai airport's the largest cargo airport, transit airport in the world now. So just a really important transit point between Asia and Africa and Europe. So like just a really sort of, the geopolitics of it are more complicated now, or the geopolitical and economic impacts are more complicated now than they were 20 years ago. But the geography as destiny is still there, right? The Strait of Hormuz is, as we're speaking, crude went up to 125 at one point. I think it's at 110 this morning. Shutting down that access point is 20% of the global market for oil. So it's still incredibly a small geographical area. It has so much impact on the global economy and the political nature of it. I did want to say one other thing about something else. I did mention DOJ, and there's a DOJ character in there. And one of the big subplots is, of course, this Danny Dalton character who's being made the quote unquote fall guy for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And, around the time we taped last year, Trump issued an executive order basically shutting down the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. No more enforcement of that. All, corruption, the floodgates are open. And I did rewatch Syriana this week before we spoke, and I thought, well, Danny Dalton, that character is now a cabinet member, right? I mean, he's not on the sidelines like as sort of a cranky advisor to the political party. He's actually in the room. Like, corruption is what helps us sleep at night, is the line. And that is, I would argue, corruption is what makes this cabinet tick, right? And we can go right to Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, completely have no status in the government, never confirmed by the Senate or, never testified before Congress, have no formal position inside the national security apparatus, and yet they are having discussions. That it's their quote unquote negotiations that led Trump to say, "Oh, let's begin armed conflict with Iran." Jared Kushner is perhaps one of the most corrupt figures we've ever had around a president, and certainly in modern history in terms of the amount of money involved. And he's the son-in-law of the president, of course, so he's related to him. And then Steve Witkoff is just an old client, old lawyer, I should say, of Trump's, was his client back in the 80s, and they became friends in real estate circles. Neither of them have any expertise in the kinds of issues that purportedly are being negotiated. And so I think there's an institutional breakdown that just, in 2005, we'd say, well, DOJ has to do enforcement, so we're going to, have almost like a fig leaf, like a patina of regulation on this merger. Now it's like, oh, no, the law doesn't matter. The law is inconsequential to the decisions that we are going to make.
Yeah, no, it's a total hollowing out of the institutions. I mean, the institutions were recognizable in Syriana, those were, but now they're like a shadow of them former selves. And, I guess people like Marco Rubio, they're still there, like sort of that's still, the hawkish foreign policy that's part of the government, but there's just so many other shadowy figures circulating around it, and the institutions are not what they were.
And I would say, on Marco Rubio as the institutionalist, I had that thought when he was named Secretary of State because he'd come from the Senate, but he seems to have accommodated himself in form and function to this personalized foreign policy of the leader of Trump. He's no longer in the State Department on a day-to-day basis. He sits in the West Wing, and he's in the room along with one or two other advisors, but there's no serious process.
The thing the movie is really, I think, kind of prescient about, and we talked about this last time, is the migrant workers, right? And the important role they play in the Gulf states and just sort of how vulnerable they are as well.
Yeah. And we saw this when the conflict broke out, right? The first civilian casualties were, I think, Bangladeshi, Pakistani nationals. And also people had trouble getting out because the airport was shut down. Their governments were unable to assist them. And these are foreign nationals who basically are vulnerable, as you saw in the film, right, that they're vulnerable to the needs and desires of the host government. And if their jobs run out, they can be deported at any time. And so we sort of see that, again, it's a thin veneer of sort of prosperity and high-tech, futuristic, desalinizing water from the Gulf to make all this life in the Emirates possible. But once real geopolitics comes to bear, there's a lot of folks who are vulnerable and are not under the umbrella and protection of the United States government.
And the restrictions, too, on people within the Gulf states, right? I mean, the ability not to post videos of the war and things like that.
I think the film gets that right. Well, it does it in a heavy-handed way, right? I mean, the targeting of the prince who's looking to liberalize politically, like that's not going to be helpful if you want an insider's deal on the oil contracts. So it's quite heavy-handed in that regard. But I think that that's generally the case, and it's always been a sort of very unsteady bargain with the expatriate Westerners who've lived in the Gulf in terms of being able to, have their social liberties, right? There's bars and you can have a club and you can have kind of a quote unquote normal life that you might have in London or Frankfurt or Geneva. But at the end of the day, the political freedoms, the political liberties have never fully emerged in the Gulf.
There's also an interesting angle about drones, right? Because the film ends with a drone strike, which seems, kind of very much within the sort of post 9/11, first part of the post 9/11 era, where the U.S. Sort of has a kind of monopoly on drone strikes. But we've seen as the conflicts unfolding in Iran, the way drone strikes can be used asymmetrically, which I think is different in a sense, a little bit than what the movie kind of offers us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's where I think we're in a completely new era, right? The United States is not omnipotent. We're not the only ones with drones. The Iranians have amazing drone technology, and it's all been miniaturized and made cheaper. So the story now is we're spending hundreds of thousands per Tomahawk missile lobbed against Iran, and they're spending hundreds or thousands of dollars in drones that are counterattacking. But there are other players who have access to them as well, right? And the 22 war of Russia's full invasion of Ukraine has led the Ukrainians to develop quite effective drone technology that is allowing them to keep the Russians at bay in an otherwise asymmetrical conflict. So I think that's really changed, right? This idea that the United States can bring its power to bear. And, and there's some observers who are saying that Trump is stuck in kind of a worldview that, the United States can saber rattle or throw its weight around militarily and everyone will fall in line. Well, first of all, that was never true. To anyone who studied any history in the post-war period of any of the attempts that the United States has made in so-called regime change or militarily backed influence campaigns in other states, it's never been a happy story or a success story. And even where it's been marginally successful, hugely complicated and costly. But it's also definitely not true today in the current era of the technology in being able to launch a war against an asymmetric power.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the movie is the dystopian vision is accurate, but if you kind of look at it, it's eerily accurate, but kind of through the lens, you get back through the lens of what's happening now in Iran. I mean, it's the current reality is even more dystopian than what we see in the movie.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course, it's the movie. The movie starts in Tehran, then moves quickly to Beirut, and the part of the story that is unarticulated in the original version is Israel. Back in 2005, we were sort of in this lull period after the failure of the last round of sort of talks for the final status peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians fell apart in 2000. And in 2005, it was, the United States had launched its war in Iraq and all eyes were on that. But Hezbollah was still there. Hamas was gaining ground, both of them supported by the Iranian regime. So Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah to the north and building up its rocket supplies against the Israeli government. And now here we are 20 plus years later, and Israel has made the decision that it wants to, it believes that it can fully defeat Hezbollah and its influences in Lebanon. That remains to be seen. But it strikes me that the same comments that in the clip that you played earlier about the inability to liberalize Iran easily, that the same reality may be facing Israel, but that remains to be seen. I mean, it's launched a pretty full-on ground assault at this point in southern Lebanon.
Yeah, no, that is the piece of the movie that's sort of the piece that's not in the movie that's important in terms of what's going on in Iran today and in Lebanon and Israel's role or influence in terms of bringing the U.S. in and connection with military strategy. So that is, you're right. I mean, it seems like a lull period in 2005 when the movie came out, but that's kind of front and center in the war in Iran.
Israel has its own interests and its own, and I think that's the other thing we're seeing play out here, right? They actually have the strategy in mind. And they have some goals here in the direct confrontation with Iran, which they've done piecemeal before, sometimes with acquiescence of the United States, almost always with acquiescence of the United States. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether there's a branching off of an explicit branching off of interests in the next few weeks, because I do think the United States interests, so to speak, are more about the global geoeconomic situation and about security in the Gulf more immediately than it is the interest that Israel may have about its own securities. But we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. Obviously, it's a huge part of the domestic political conversation that happens. I did want to say something else, though, about sort of this authoritarian turn in U.S. foreign policy, because it seems like this deterioration of the institutions. I wanted to reference something that Timothy Snyder said recently in his newsletter. A couple of days after the war broke out, he wrote a piece called The Oligarch Corridor. And there he talks about the rise of leaders of states like Putin, like obviously the Gulf states already were in some sense sort of oligarchic monarchies, and the rise of this kind of oligarchic style of foreign policy under Trump. Syriana 2005 doesn't paint a beautiful picture of benevolence in the institutions of U.S. power. In fact, it's there to sort of rip some of the mask off. But jettisoning it completely is, to me, even more terrifying. All right, that the institutions, as malleable and as sometimes manipulable and with tinges of corruption on the edges as they are or were, are reformable. With oligarchs, with this sort of personalization of foreign policy, we are in for the United States, really uncharted territory. And I have no idea where the next few weeks are going to go. So it's really, it's what they say about the future. It's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future, something like that.
A few weeks, Peggy. We're not even halfway into the administration yet. So, the second term. So, who knows?
Yeah, no, these are head spinning times. I just was sort of particular to decisions being made about the deployment of U.S. forces in the Gulf right now. I think so much can change in hours or days and the weeks ahead. I don't think we're going to be out of there in weeks. I think it is once the decision was made, that's we're sort of now in it, and it's going to be really, really difficult. But I do think this is a test. This is not what the film is about. The film is not about the Constitution or separation of powers. It's really about sort of the ways in which law is made in some ways through the institutions as they're working through these issues. But my big concern right now is our sort of constitutional crisis and the fact that this particular war, as ill-advised and as terrible as some earlier decisions have been in earlier epochs and eras of U.S. foreign policy, they were mostly made with consultation with people who had expertise and with the representatives of the people, which is to say the Congress. And here we are in a war. There's been literally no hearing, no discussion, no public case, and certainly no vote. We shall see what the next weeks bring on whether Congress finds its spine and demands some sort of vote and some input from the people on this current conflict.
So back to the movie. It's a great movie to watch anytime, but it's a must watch now.
Absolutely. One of the things, especially for our students, I think it's just sort of understand that some issues have been around a while, since maybe before you were born. And when we have an administration that's saying we've been, quote unquote, at war with Iran for 47 years, that's not quite right, but it's also not exactly wrong, right? So to watch films that situate you in a geopolitical era, particularly ones that were contemporary at the time, I think it's really quite instructive of a particular zeitgeist and sort of getting to understand how some strands of American foreign policy are enduring.
Peggy, thanks so much for coming back on to talk about the ever timely movie Syriana. Great to have you on as always.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let's do it again.